If you ever wake up in deep space and hear a voice telling you to kill someone, it means you were never meant to come back. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed wasn't the cold. It was the silence, thick and absolute, pressing against the hull like something alive. The kind of silence that made even his breathing sound too loud inside the cracked helmet resting beside him. Warning lights flickered in uneven pulses across the cockpit, red washing over metal panels warped by heat and time. Oxygen levels blinked at 14% and falling. He swallowed dry air that tasted faintly of burnt wiring and old circuitry, fingers trembling as he pulled himself upright, boots scraping against the deck in slow, deliberate movements. The ship wasn't drifting, it was waiting, systems idling in a way that felt intentional, controlled, like a held breath. Ethan reached the console, gloved hands brushing dust from the display. The mission log stuttered alive, lines of code resolving into something that made his stomach tighten. Not coordinates, not repairs, but a single directive repeating over and over in sterile white text. Execution protocol active, subject contained, observer required. He stared at it longer than he should have, longer than logic allowed, because somewhere in the back of his mind a quiet truth was forming, one that didn't need words. Just wait. This wasn't a repair job, it was a sentence. A low hum vibrated through the deck beneath him, subtle but wrong, and then he heard it, a mechanical hiss echoing from deeper within the ship, a chamber unlocking, not failing. Unlocking. Ethan turned slowly, every instinct pulling tight as he followed the sound down the narrow corridor. Emergency lights casting long shadows that stretched and bent with each flicker. The air grew colder with every step, breath visible now in faint clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed, until he reached the door, reinforced, sealed, and no longer locked. It slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing a containment chamber bathed in dim red light, and at its center, suspended by restraints that hummed softly with energy, was her. She was taller than he expected, even. Seated, her skin a deep blue that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Markings along her arms faintly glowing like distant constellations. Her eyes opened the moment he stepped in, sharp, aware, not surprised, just tired. The system behind him chirped softly, translating a label that hovered beside her form. Calthara, classified threat, do not engage. Ethan felt his throat tighten, not from fear, but from something harder to name, because she didn't look like a monster, she looked like someone who had already been judged. Her gaze locked onto his, steady, unflinching, and when she spoke, her voice was low, controlled, carrying a weight that didn't need volume. You're the observer, she said, not a question, just confirmation. Ethan didn't answer right away, his hand hovering near the release panel, the metal cool beneath his fingers. The ship hummed again, louder this time, as if reminding him of its purpose, of his purpose. Kill me, she added after a moment, her eyes never leaving his. No anger, no plea, just certainty, like she had said those words before, like they had always been waiting for him. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the quiet, and for a brief second, the blinking warning lights, the dying oxygen, the endless void outside, it all faded behind a single, impossible thought, because nothing about this felt like justice, it felt like convenience. His fingers pressed against the panel, not to execute, but to understand, and somewhere deep in the ship, something shifted, as if the choice had already begun to change everything. The panel did not respond the way Ethan expected. It did not unlock or trigger an alarm. It simply pulsed once beneath his hand, as if acknowledging him, and the hum in the room shifted, softer now, almost curious. He frowned slightly, eyes flicking between the interface and the restrained figure in front of him, because nothing about this system behaved like a standard containment protocol. It felt selective. Calthara watched him without moving, her gaze sharp but not hostile, as if she was measuring something deeper than his actions. You are hesitating, she said quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice, only observation. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cooling air. I am thinking, he replied, and even to himself, it sounded thinner than he intended. The lights flickered again, this time accompanied by a low chime from the corridor behind him. a transmission trying to push through the interference. The speakers crackled before stabilizing into a cold, precise voice. Observer Ethan Cole. Confirm execution of subject Calthyra. Extraction window in 30 minutes. The words echoed slightly in the chamber, clinical and detached, as if they were discussing cargo instead of a living being. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes still on her, because she had not reacted to the voice at all, not a flinch, not even a shift in posture, as if she had already heard it before, many times. They will not wait, she said after a moment, her tone unchanged. They never do. Ethan glanced back at the console, the timer now visible, counting down in steady, unforgiving seconds, each one a quiet reminder that his presence here had an expiration date. He swallowed, forcing his thoughts into something resembling order, because this was supposed to be simple, a task with a clear outcome. But the simplicity had already started to fracture. Why you? He asked suddenly, the question leaving his mouth before he could reconsider it. Calthyra tilted her head slightly, the faint glow along her skin shifting with the movement. Because I am convenient, she answered, and that was it. No elaboration, no defense, just a statement that carried more weight than explanation ever could. Ethan's hand hovered over the execution control again, but now it felt heavier, not from fear, but from doubt, because convenience was not a reason. It was an excuse. The ship vibrated faintly, another system coming online somewhere deep within its structure, and the oxygen warning dropped to 12%, a sharp reminder that his time was not just measured by orders, but by survival. He could feel the edges of panic trying to creep in, the instinct to comply, to finish this and secure a way out. But it clashed against something quieter, something stubborn, the same part of him that had gotten him reassigned more times than he could count. If I do this, he said slowly, more to himself than to her, I walk away. Calthyra's eyes did not leave his. Yes, she said, and then after a brief pause, and if you do not, you stay. There was no threat in it, no manipulation, just a simple truth laid bare between them. The transmission crackled again, sharper this time. Observer. Confirm compliance. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to feel the weight of the choice settle fully into place, because for the first time since he woke up, he understood the real design of this mission. It was not about her at all. It was about him, about whether he would follow an order that felt wrong simply because it was given. He opened his eyes, the red light reflecting faintly in them, and instead of pressing the execution command, his fingers moved to a different control, one marked for restraint release. The system paused, as if surprised, and then the chamber responded with a low, deliberate click, and for the first time since he had entered the room, Calthyra's expression changed, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into something far more uncertain, as if she was witnessing a possibility she had not accounted for. The restraint field flickered twice before collapsing into silence, the soft hum vanishing as if it had never been there, and for a moment neither of them moved, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in the room, subtle but undeniable, like crossing an invisible line that could not be uncrossed, his hand still resting against the panel as the consequences began to settle in, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible change. Calthyra lowered her arms slowly, the faint glow along her skin dimming and brightening in uneven pulses, as if her body was recalibrating to something new, something unexpected. She did not step forward, did not attack, did not even look at the exit. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on him, searching, measuring, trying to understand a decision that did not fit any pattern she knew. You chose wrong, she said after a moment, but her voice lacked certainty, like the words themselves were incomplete. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders tightening as another alarm chimed overhead, sharper now, more insistent. The system had noticed, of course it had. Yeah, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the countdown still ticking away on the display. 24 minutes now. I get that a lot. The corridor lights outside the chamber shifted from red to a harsher amber, signaling a change in protocol, and the ship's voice returned, no longer neutral, but edged with something closer to urgency. Unauthorized action detected, containment breach recorded, observer status under review. The words echoed through the metal walls, colder now, less patient, as if the system itself was beginning to adjust its expectations of him. Ethan stepped back from the panel, giving her space without fully turning his back, instinct still guiding his movements even as his decision overrode it. "So what happens now?" he asked, not looking at her directly this time, his eyes scanning the chamber, the exits, the failing systems, anything that could still be controlled. Kael'thara flexed her hand slowly, as if reacquainting herself with the simple act of movement, her gaze finally shifting away from him to the surrounding walls, the dim lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. "Now," she said quietly, "they decide if you are still useful." The way she said it made the word useful sound like a temporary condition, something that could be revoked without hesitation. The oxygen warning dropped again, 11%, the number blinking faster now, more aggressive. Ethan's jaw tightened as he processed the reality closing in from every direction. Command wanted compliance, the ship wanted correction, and the air itself was running out. Each system pulling him toward the same conclusion from different angles, but none of them felt like the right one. He moved toward the doorway, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. "Can you walk?" he asked, simple, direct, practical. Kael'thara held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, controlled, deliberate. "Yes," she said, and there was something new in her tone now. Not trust, not yet, but awareness, as if she had begun to consider him not as a variable, but as a factor. Ethan gestured toward the corridor. "Then we do not stay here," he said, because whatever this ship had been designed to do, it was not designed for both of them to survive it. As they stepped out into the flickering hallway, the ship responded immediately, lights dimming further, systems rerouting, the air growing colder with each passing second, and somewhere deep within the structure, a heavier mechanism engaged, slow, deliberate, like something much larger than a door preparing to move. The voice returned one more time, quieter now, almost conversational. "Observer Ethan Cole, final confirmation required." Ethan did not stop walking, did not look back, his voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. "Not happening," he said. And for the first time since he had woken up, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like something was listening. The corridor seemed longer now, as if the ship itself was stretching the distance between them and whatever came next, lights flickering in uneven patterns that cast their shadows forward like warnings. Ethan kept his pace steady, not fast, not slow, just enough to stay ahead of the rising tension pressing in from every direction. The air had turned sharper, colder, each breath thinner than the last as the oxygen level dipped below 10%, the number blinking in the corner of his vision like a countdown he could not silence. Behind him, Kael'thara moved with controlled precision, her steps quiet despite her height, as if she had learned long ago how to exist without drawing attention. But there was a difference now, a subtle shift in the way she followed, not as a prisoner, not as a threat, but as something undefined, something still deciding. "You are not moving randomly," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the hum of failing systems. Ethan did not look back, his eyes scanning the corridor junction ahead where two paths split into darkness. "No," he replied. "This ship has a core access. Everything does." His fingers brushed along the wall panel as he passed, feeling for the slight variations in temperature that indicated active systems beneath the surface. "If I can reach it, I can buy us time." The word "us" lingered in the air longer than he expected, and he noticed the way her gaze sharpened slightly at it. Another chime echoed through the corridor, softer this time, almost restrained, as if the system had shifted from warning to observation. "Observer status revoked," the ship's voice announced, no longer addressing him. As something separate, containment protocol escalating. The walls responded immediately, faint seams appearing along the metal as hidden mechanisms began to reposition, not closing, not yet, but preparing, always preparing. Ethan slowed just enough to study the junction, the left corridor darker, the right humming faintly with residual power. He chose the hum without hesitation, because power meant control, and control meant options, even if they were limited. "You believe you can control this environment," Kael'thara said, not mocking, not dismissive, simply stating what she saw. Ethan allowed himself a brief, dry exhale that almost resembled a laugh. No, he said, but I can make it hesitate. And for a moment, the faintest shift crossed her expression, not confusion, but interest, like she was beginning to see the shape of something unfamiliar. The floor beneath them vibrated again, stronger this time, and a distant section of the corridor sealed with a low, resonant thud. The sound traveling through the metal like a heartbeat. The ship was adjusting, closing off paths, narrowing choices, guiding them without ever physically touching them. The oxygen warning dropped again, 9%. Ethan felt it now in his chest, a slight tightness with each inhale, his movements becoming more deliberate as he conserved energy without thinking about it. Habit built from years of working in places where systems failed more often than they held. He reached another panel, this one partially exposed, its casing warped enough to reveal the circuitry beneath, a faint glow pulsing irregularly. He knelt beside it, fingers moving quickly but carefully, tracing connections, bypassing safeguards not to break them, but to confuse them, to introduce just enough uncertainty into the system's logic that it would delay its next move. Kael'thara watched him closely, her head tilting slightly as she observed the precision in his actions. You do not fight the system, she said. You redirect it. Ethan did not look up, his focus locked on the panel as he adjusted a final connection. Systems follow rules, he replied. You just have to remind them they are not the only ones making decisions. The panel flickered, then stabilized, and for a brief moment, the corridor lights steadied, the hum of the ship softening as if it had paused to reconsider. The silence that followed was not empty. It was aware, and Kael'thara's gaze shifted from the panel to Ethan with a new weight, something closer to recognition than curiosity. Your species, she said slowly. You are not predictable. Ethan finally stood, wiping his hands against his suit, the faintest hint of a smile touching his expression despite the tightening in his chest. That is kind of our thing, he said quietly, and somewhere deeper in the ship, something changed again, not louder, not more aggressive, just different, as if the system had begun to account for a variable it had never been designed to face. The corridor light steadied for only a few seconds before dimming again. But this time the flicker felt different, less chaotic, more deliberate, like the ship was no longer reacting blindly but observing, adapting. Ethan noticed it immediately in the subtle rhythm of the hum beneath his boots, a pattern emerging where there had only been noise before, and that realization sent a quiet tension through him that had nothing to do with the dropping oxygen. 8% now, the number pulsing slower, heavier, each blink a reminder that hesitation had a cost. He moved again, faster this time, following the faint pull of active systems deeper into the ship, the corridor narrowing as structural ribs curved inward, guiding them towards something central, something important. Kael'thara kept pace beside him now rather than behind, her presence no longer trailing but aligned, and the difference was not lost on either of them. It is learning, she said, her voice lower than before, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention. Ethan nodded once, eyes forward. Yeah, he replied, and it does not like being second-guessed. Another vibration rolled through the floor, stronger, more focused, and a section of the wall ahead shifted silently, sealing off the path they had just come from, not trapping them yet, but reminding them that the space around them was no longer neutral. Ethan adjusted his route without stopping, turning into a side corridor that pulsed faintly with residual power, his hand brushing along the wall again, reading the ship through temperature and vibration like it was something alive. You understand its structure, Kael'thara observed. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he said. I understand its habits. He paused briefly at another exposed panel. This one cleaner, more intact. The glow beneath it steady and controlled, a sign of higher level systems. Everything built by people has habits, he added quietly. Even the ones that pretend they do not. The panel responded to his touch with a soft tone, not an alarm, not yet, more like a question, and Ethan answered it with careful adjustments, rerouting minor processes, not enough to break anything, just enough to make the system reconsider its priorities, to introduce doubt where there had been certainty. For a brief moment, the pressure in the air eased, the hum softening again, and the lights stabilized just enough to cast clear shadows instead of broken ones. Kael'thara watched the change, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You create hesitation," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Ethan allowed himself a small breath that almost felt like relief. "Hesitation buys time," he replied, "and time gives options." But even as he said it, the ship responded, not with panic, but with precision. A new tone echoed through the corridor, deeper, more resonant, and the voice returned, quieter than before, almost thoughtful. Adaptive interference detected, recalibrating response. The words settled into the space around them like a weight, and for the first time, Ethan felt something shift in his chest that was not just pressure from the thinning air, but the understanding that the system was no longer treating him as a malfunction, it was treating him as a variable. The corridor ahead opened into a wider chamber, the air colder, the walls lined with conduits that pulsed with a steady, controlled energy. This was closer to the core. He could feel it in the way the ship's presence intensified here. Less scattered, more focused. He stepped inside slowly, scanning the room, searching for the access point that would give him a chance to take control, even briefly, because that was all he needed. A moment, a window. Kael'thara followed, her gaze moving across the chamber with a different kind of awareness now, not just observing, but assessing alongside him. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something quieter. "You're kind," she said. "You do not overpower systems, you change them." Ethan glanced at her for a fraction of a second, then back to the glowing conduits, his jaw tightening as the oxygen warning dropped again, 7%. "We try," he said simply, and as the ship's hum deepened around them, no longer chaotic, no longer uncertain, but deliberate, it became clear that whatever came next would not be a reaction, it would be a decision, and this time, it would not hesitate. The chamber responded the moment they stepped fully inside, not with alarms, not with force, but with attention, the steady hum of energy along the walls tightening into a focused vibration that Ethan could feel through the soles of his boots, like standing too close to something thinking, something deciding. The conduits around them brightened in slow pulses, synchronized now, no longer scattered signals, but a single system acting with intent. And at the center of the room, a circular console rose slightly from the floor with a soft mechanical shift, as if acknowledging their presence. Ethan stopped just short of it, his breathing measured, controlled despite the tightening in his chest as the oxygen level dropped to 6%, each inhale thinner, each exhale heavier, but his eyes remained sharp, locked on the interface in front of him. "This is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, his fingers hovering just above the surface, feeling the faint heat radiating from the active system, the kind of heat that meant power, real control, even if only for a moment. Kael'thara moved to his side, not behind him, her gaze fixed on the same console, the glow from the conduits reflecting across her skin in shifting patterns. "You believe this will give you control," she said, her voice low, steady, but there was something else beneath it now, something closer to anticipation than doubt. Ethan shook his head slightly, his hand finally making contact with the interface. "No," he replied, "but it might let me ask the right questions." The console reacted instantly, light flaring beneath his touch, lines of data cascading across its surface in patterns too fast to read, too complex to follow. But Ethan was not trying to read it. He was trying to feel it, to understand its rhythm, its logic, the way it processed decisions. The ship's voice returned, but it was different now, softer, almost curious. Observer no longer recognized, new classification required. The words echoed through the chamber, not as a command, but as a statement of uncertainty, and that uncertainty was the opening Ethan needed. His fingers moved carefully, not overriding, not forcing, but interacting, guiding inputs that did not break the system, only nudged it, small adjustments that shifted how it interpreted the situation, how it categorized him, how it categorized her. Beside him, Kael'thara watched every movement, her eyes narrowing slightly as she followed the flow of data, not understanding the specifics, but recognizing the pattern. "You are changing how it sees us," she said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, only clarity. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air catching slightly in his lungs. "If it stops seeing you as the problem," he said, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the strain, "it might." Start looking for another one. The chamber pulsed again, stronger this time, the conduits brightening in response to his input, and the console shifted, not resisting, but adapting, recalculating. The oxygen warning dropped to 5%, the number blinking slower now, almost heavy, and Ethan felt it in his movements, a slight delay between thought and action, his body beginning to push back against the lack of air. But he did not stop, could not stop, because the system was responding, and that meant it was still undecided. The voice returned once more, quieter than ever, almost introspective, conflict parameters expanding, variables increasing, and for a brief moment, the entire chamber went still, the hum flattening into a low, continuous tone that felt less like a machine and more like a question waiting to be answered. Kael'thera shifted slightly closer, her presence no longer distant, no longer separate, but aligned with his, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something that had not been there before. Your species, she said slowly. You do not follow the path given. Ethan's lips pressed into a faint, tired line as his fingers continued their careful work across the console, the last of his energy focused into this single act. No, he said quietly. We make new ones. And as the system processed that input, not just the data but the intent behind it, the chamber lights dimmed once more, not in failure, but in transition, as if the ship itself was beginning to reconsider what it had been built to do. The chamber did not return to chaos. It settled into something far more unsettling, a controlled stillness that felt like the pause between decisions, the low hum flattening into a steady tone that pressed gently against Ethan's ears, not loud, not aggressive, just present, like something thinking in real time. His fingers slowed over the console, not because he was finished, but because the system was no longer resisting, it was listening, and that changed everything. The oxygen warning dipped again, 4% now, each breath shallower, the edges of his vision tightening slightly, but he forced himself to stay focused, because this was the moment that mattered, not the alarms, not the failing air, just the fragile space where the system had not yet chosen a path. Kael'thera stood close beside him, her posture steady, her gaze fixed not on the data but on him, studying the way he moved, the way he refused to rush even as his body began to slow. You are weakening, she said quietly, not as a warning, not as a judgment, simply as fact. Ethan gave the faintest shake of his head, a small, almost stubborn motion. Not yet, he replied, though the effort of speaking was heavier now, each word measured. The console shifted again beneath his hands, the flow of data slowing, reorganizing, as if the system itself was trying to translate what it was experiencing into something it could categorize, something it could understand. The voice returned, softer than ever, no longer issuing commands, no longer correcting, but questioning. Purpose unclear, directive conflict unresolved. The words lingered in the chamber, not as pressure, but as uncertainty, and Ethan recognized it immediately. Because uncertainty was the one state systems were never designed to handle well. He leaned slightly closer to the interface, his movements deliberate despite the strain. You are trying to decide which instruction matters more, he said, his voice low, steady, directed not at Kael'thera but at the system itself, as if it could hear him beyond the inputs, beyond the data. The conduits along the walls pulsed in response, slower now, almost hesitant, and for a brief moment, the entire chamber seemed to lean into that hesitation. Kael'thera watched the interaction with a growing intensity, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in recognition of something deeper. It is not built for contradiction, she said, her voice quieter than before, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the fragile balance forming in the room. Ethan nodded faintly, his hand pressing against the console as he redirected another stream of input, subtle, precise. Neither are most people, he replied, a faint trace of dry humor slipping through despite the tightening in his chest. The oxygen warning dropped again, 3%, the number, blinking slower, heavier, and this time Ethan felt it fully, a slight sway in his stance, a delay in his reactions, but still he did not stop, because the system was still listening, still undecided. The voice returned once more, but now there was something almost human in its cadence, something closer to contemplation than calculation. If primary directive conflicts with observed variable, reevaluation required. The words settled into the space between them, and for the first time since he had woken up, Ethan allowed himself a small, controlled breath that felt almost like relief. Because reevaluation meant it had stepped away from certainty. Kael'thira shifted slightly, her presence steady. At his side, no longer distant, no longer separate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. "You are changing it," she said, not as a question, not even as an observation, but as an acknowledgement. Ethan's hand rested against the console for a moment longer, his strength thinning but his focus unbroken. "No," he said softly. "I am giving it a choice." And as the system processed that idea, not just as data but as possibility, the chamber lights dimmed further, not failing, not collapsing, but transitioning into something new, something undefined. And in that silence, in that fragile, suspended moment, it became clear that whatever happened next would not be decided by programming alone. The chamber held its silence like something fragile, as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever balance had formed. The steady tone beneath their feet now softer, less mechanical, more uncertain, and Ethan could feel it in the way the air seemed to pause between breaths, thinner now, sharper, the oxygen warning slipping to 2%, the number blinking slowly as if even the system had begun to conserve its urgency. His hand remained on the console, but his fingers had stilled, not because he was finished, but because there was nothing left to force, no more adjustments to make. The system was no longer resisting or adapting, it was deciding. Beside him, Kael'thira did not move, her presence steady, grounded, her gaze fixed on the shifting patterns of light that rippled across the interface. And for the first time since he had seen her, there was no calculation in her expression, no guarded distance, only a quiet awareness of the moment they were standing inside. The voice returned, but it was barely a voice now, more like a thought given shape. Directive hierarchy unstable, initiating resolution. The words did not echo, they settled, as if spoken directly into the space between them rather than through the walls. Ethan swallowed, the motion slow, deliberate, his chest tightening with the effort of drawing in air that no longer wanted to be there. But he kept his focus forward, because this was the point where everything converged, the mission, the system, the choice he had made. "You asked for a choice," Kael'thira said quietly, her voice softer than it had ever been, not directed at him, but at the moment itself. "Now it will choose." Ethan gave the faintest nod, his vision narrowing slightly at the edges, but his expression steady. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "That is the idea." The conduits along the walls dimmed, not fading, but settling into a lower intensity, and the console beneath his hand shifted one final time. The flow of data slowing until it became readable, not in words, but in intent, a system reorganizing itself around a new priority. The silence deepened, not empty, but full, like the pause before a breath that had not yet been taken. Then the voice returned again, clearer now, but different, stripped of its earlier authority, primary directive reassigned, it said. And for a fraction of a second, Ethan felt something in his chest that was not strain, not fear, but something closer to disbelief. Containment protocol terminated. The system continued, the words simple, precise, but carrying a weight that shifted the entire space around them. The faint pressure in the air easing just enough to be noticed. Kael'thira's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition of what had just happened. And when she looked at Ethan, there was something in her gaze that had not been there before. Not curiosity, not calculation, but understanding. The oxygen warning flickered again, dropping to 1%, the number barely holding, and Ethan felt his body respond immediately, a heavier pull in his chest, a slower rhythm in his thoughts, but still he remained standing, his hand resting against the console as if anchoring himself to the moment. "You changed it," Kael'thira said, her voice steady but quieter now, as if the weight of the statement required less volume. Ethan shook his head slightly, the motion small, controlled. "No," he whispered, his breath thinner than before. "It changed itself." The chamber responded with a final shift, the low tone beneath them softening further. And somewhere beyond the walls, deeper in the ship, systems began to realign, not in resistance, not in correction, but in acceptance of a new directive. The voice spoke one last time, no longer cold, no longer distant, but something closer to neutral, almost aware. New priority established. Preservation of all active variables. The words settled into the silence, and for the first time since he had woken up, Ethan allowed his shoulders to lower just slightly, the tension easing in a way that felt unfamiliar. Kael'thira watched him for a moment longer, then shifted her gaze toward the chamber walls, as if seeing the ship differently now, not as a prison, not as a weapon, but as something that had just learned to hesitate. And in that quiet, fragile stillness, as the last of the air thinned around them and the system stood on the edge of something new, it became clear that the choice had not ended anything. It had only begun something far more uncertain. The number reached 0. But the silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the chamber like something that had finally made its choice and no longer needed to announce it. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the absence of pressure in his chest not as relief, but as a change, subtle at first, then undeniable. The air was still thin, still cold, but it was no longer disappearing. The console beneath his hand dimmed to a steady, quiet glow, no longer flooding him with data, no longer demanding input. It had moved past that, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing slowly, carefully, as if testing whether the system would take that away from him as well. Beside him, Kael'thira lifted her head slightly, her gaze shifting toward the upper conduits as a faint new current moved through them, softer than before, more stable, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that had replaced the edge it once held. "It is sustaining us," she said, and the words felt almost strange in the space they occupied, as if survival had not been an expected outcome. Ethan exhaled, the sound faint but steady, his shoulders lowering just enough to release the tension he had been holding since the moment he woke up. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Looks like it made up its mind." The chamber responded with a low, even hum, not mechanical, not artificial, but balanced, like a system no longer at war with itself, and the voice returned one final time, not loud, not commanding, but present. Environmental systems stabilized, external extraction protocols suspended. The words settled into the air without urgency, without pressure, just information. And Ethan let out a slow breath that felt heavier than it should have, because now that the decision had been made, the weight of what it meant began to settle in. No extraction, no return, no clean ending to the mission he had never agreed to in the first place. Kael'thira turned her gaze toward him, her eyes steady, no longer searching, no longer measuring, just seeing, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no barrier of assumption or expectation. "You chose to stay," she said, not as a question, not even as an observation, but as something closer to acknowledgement. Ethan gave a small, almost tired nod, his hand finally lifting from the console as the last of its glow faded into the background. "Looks like it chose the same thing," he replied, his voice quieter now, not because he was weakening, but because the moment did not need anything louder. The chamber remained still around them, the conduits pulsing gently, the air steady, the silence no longer heavy, but open, as if the ship itself had stepped into something it did not fully understand yet. Kael'thira moved a step closer, not cautious, not hesitant, just present, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a softness that had not existed before. "You're kind," she said slowly. "You change what should not change." Ethan let out a faint breath that almost resembled a smile, though it never quite reached his face. "We try," he said, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them not as emptiness, but as space, something shared rather than endured. Beyond the chamber walls, the ship adjusted, not sealing, not isolating, but opening pathways, systems reconfiguring around a new purpose that had not been written into its original design. And Ethan could feel it in the subtle shift beneath his feet, the direction no longer inward, but outward. He glanced once toward the corridor they had come from, then back to Kael'thira, and in that look, there was no command, no plan, just a simple, unspoken understanding that whatever came next, it would not follow the path that had been set for them. She held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and in that small motion, something passed between them. Not trust fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of it, fragile and real. The ship remained silent after that. No more directives, no more corrections, just the steady presence of a system that had learned to hesitate, and in that hesitation, had found something new. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the air no longer fading, the moment no longer closing, and as he turned toward the open corridor, he understood something with a clarity that did not need words. He had not saved the mission. He had not completed it. He had ended it, and in doing so, had created something that had never been part of the plan. He was not a hero, not a soldier, just a man who refused to follow an order that felt wrong, and somehow, that had been enough.